Boardroom Bound, episode 165, How a Curated Online Presence Can Impact Your Board Search, with Katherine Johnson.
If I'm used to being in a place where I'm executing all the time, right? And I'm moving into or wanting to move into a role that's more advisory, how do I communicate differently? How do I, become part of a board of directors? What's really needed from me? How do I make sure that I'm showing up in a way where I understand what's needed from me and that there's the presence through listening instead of being so directive?
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring and existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. And in today's episode, we're speaking with Katherine Johnson. She is the founder of True Self Presence Consulting and the Leadership Presence Lab. And she helps people figure out the intersection of presence, personal brand, power, and style. And we can all think about that if we're going to need that to come across to land the board seats that we want. And she's going to help us figure out how we bridge that today. Before we jump into today's show, I'd like to share a message from our sponsor about director certification. Want to join your first board, or are you looking for additional board seat opportunities? In either scenario, be sure to be disciplined in your approach. Now, through the Becoming an Exceptional Board Director Candidate Coaching and Certification course, you get both modern board director candidate packaging and modern board operations knowledge integrated within one program. Remember, the key to landing additional or your first board seat is in your packaging. Make the effort to do it right. Program graduates also receive their globally recognized International Board Director Competency Designation upon course completion. It's designed for individuals and groups. You can learn more at bit.ly/IBDC-D. That's bit.ly, bit.ly/IBCDC-D. And now let's jump into the show. Katherine Johnson, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Hi, Alexander. Thanks for having me.
Well, delighted to have you on the show today. And this is going to be one of those episodes where I just know the listeners are going to listen to it again and again, because this is one of those takeaways you're going, my gosh, there's so much that I can learn from this to do practically in my search, whether it's my first board seat or my second board seat. We can all get better at representing ourselves. And you are an expert on it, and you've brought it to so many people. But I'm so excited. I want to dive into it. But let me stop there. Let's back up and let's start at the beginning. How did you become to be this sort of communication subject matter expert? How did that story begin before we get into all the top tips you're going to share today?
Like many people, I'd say my whole life, right? Once you get to a point in your life, you can look back and you can see how it all informs it. I've always had a passion for understanding people, right? That's at the heart of things, being curious and understanding how interpersonal dynamics work, where power comes from, what power looks like. I know you've had other conversations about that too, like not the sense of power over, but personal power. And then as I got, into my...
By the way, I'm thinking of Amy Cuddy here, right, in her power pose. That's what's coming to mind.
Yes. So there's a lot of social psychologists. Amy Cuddy is one of them. You've got sociologist Brene Brown, and then tons of leadership work where we're looking at the human dynamics of how we move through the world, right? How we exert influence, how we connect with others, how we motivate and spread ideas. So there's the skills and the behaviors and kind of the things you would put on your CV. And then there's also the reality of these dynamics of how we connect to our energies, how we push people away or pull people in, how we establish trustworthiness and credibility. So I've always been interested in that. And to be honest, it really started for me with my own experiences around power and presence that came from sports. This started at a very early age, but I, as a junior athlete and all the way up through college, I played a sport where I learned what it meant to have this inner game and this outer game of how I showed up and how that would impact performance, how I could keep elevating to, higher levels of achievement. And that translates, understanding how you show up, and one, what that communicates to yourself, but also what that communicates outwardly. That seeded really early, and then I just started seeing how this translated in all areas of our life, and working with leaders, and specifically executives or people, stepping into that next level, whether it's board service or something else. It's still incredibly relevant. And it's one of those things that's it's like a constellation of cues, and they can be intangible. And so some people don't think about it, or they think about it in a very one-dimensional way. So for me, it's a really rich intersection of leadership, power, style, personal brand, and I just love it.
It's really interesting. I mean, as we're talking about the board level, clearly we're thinking sort of top of the
Mhm.
house, C-suite board type space in a, let's call it a corporate environment where probably many of our listeners are growing up and excelling in their careers by doing things really well. So the guidance you're giving clearly is going to resonate with them. Do you think it's the same guidance you would give someone at the beginning stages of their corporate career as they're moving up, or does it matter once you're, say, in the hierarchy, leading teams and managing
I
people?
think it matters all the time, right? Being aware of your presence and your personal brand, it's really your calling card. And so at one level of your career, you may be thinking it from an aspirational point of view, right? What you want to live into. And um, let's say it's earlier in your career, you don't have as much of the doing. You're still working on that in your career and those skills and the experiences. It's as important to be aware of your being, because that's what I hear behind the scenes. Like, I just love the conversations that I get access to behind the scenes, and people talk so much about who people are being, how they're, authentic, how they are aligned in a level of integrity of, who they are, how they show up. Um, they're genuine. And this isn't, just soft and squishy. This is like people make um, split decisions about you all the time, and that can open doors or it can close doors. So thinking about it at that level, and then as people move into that, you know, being in board service or being ready for stepping into that, it's thinking about it in a nuanced way of, okay, how do I need to shift? How do I need to shift my energy if I'm used to being at a place where I'm executing all the time, right? And I'm moving into or wanting to move into a role that's more advisory. How do I communicate differently? How do I, become part of a board of directors? What's really needed from me? How do I make sure that I'm showing up in a way where I understand what's needed from me, and that there's the presence through listening instead of being so directive. Like, I get so many stories from people who are either working with boards of directors or they're, headhunters, and they talk about things like that that are missing, that people just don't seem to understand how that's either creating barriers, or it's just lacking. It's kind of undermining their overall presence as they do their search.
What you're saying makes sense. I think the question, what I was asking for, imagining someone earlier in a career, we would probably as managers go, that person has potential, right? So you're certainly communicating that. But even going from, say, the C-suite to your first board role, you have to have the potential to be in there. But of course, that's ironic because no one wants to hire someone who hasn't been there before. How to get the job, that experience out the job. You want someone who's been there and done that. So it's not just potential, but the credibility that you bring, the trustworthiness for, probably very important decisions that are many times are private, should never become public. But also, I think that you talked about that authenticity, right? Because if you're trying to assume how two candidates are going to fit, and if something feels off about one, you're probably going to go with your gut. If you're not authentic, you can't really trust them because you have to get them into the right place. So all this makes sense, right? These are big, important things I think are hard for a lot of people to wrap their arms around, right? So how did you become someone who really figured out not only how to understand it for yourself, but to explain it to others?
You know, it's for me, it's something, I can see in my whole life. It's learning. There's whether you want to call it an emotional intelligence, there's a way that I read people and then have learned, there's a science and an art to it. And the science does tell us, like, all the ways our nonverbal brains are reading people for cues. And what's interesting is, let's say we take that, who you're being versus, what you're doing. Well, when we're evaluating people, and we have to remember there's first impressions, right? So in those first impressions, we're doing something that's called thin slicing, and we don't even know we're doing it. It's a survival mechanism. It's evolutionary. It's something we do, and we're thin slicing, and it means we take minimal amounts of information, and we make it have meaning. And we do it because we have so much data to process in meeting someone in our whole day. And so to be efficient, our brain thin slices and takes little bits of data and makes meaning out of it. And we start sorting, right? And in like the most primary, level of sorting, it's like, do I give this person more attention or not? Right? So that's where we're like, you read potential. And that's what executive presence, there's different definitions. One way to think of executive presence is the constellation of cues that people use to evaluate your leadership potential. Doesn't mean it's the real thing. There's lots of people who have like a, flashy sports car and it's got no engine in it. You need to have both, right? You need to have the exterior that gives people that quick cue of like, yes, and then you back it up. You bring, you've got all the goods. Well, understanding all those cues you might be sending, at first, yeah, maybe this feels overwhelming because we have to think about appearance, body language, communication, which includes as much what you're saying as how you're saying it, your digital footprint, right? I'm sure you've had lots of conversations now about how our digital footprint, we're connecting virtually. People see all these, they Google you, they find out all these things about you before they even get a chance to meet you and get your live energy. And so then after digital footprint comes your energy. We react to people's energy. How do you shift a room when you walk into it or when you show up online, especially if you're doing, virtual interviews? So there's all this to think about, and to know that through all that, people are trying to answer two essential questions. Can I trust this person, and can I respect this person's capabilities? And that comes across, there's a study done, and they put that into, those are two things being evaluated. It's warmth and competence. And so if you think of that as a matrix, that you get four quadrants, right? The quadrant you want to fall in is having high warmth and high competence. And one of the mistakes that leaders make, and this is proven out in research, and I see this as something also with board service, is people get into new positions and they think, well, I need to prove myself. I need to prove why I'm here. And they start focusing on the competence as a way to show that they belong, like you chose the right person, but they're doing it from a self-serving standpoint. And that proving the confidence before establishing the trust through different cues of warmth and connection undermines, because the human brain reads strength without trust is a threat.
So that makes so much sense. And let's play out a scenario here. So someone lands their first board seat. They've been working on it for, let's say, 2 years. They're so excited. They finally made it. They landed a public company board seat. It's a compensated position, and they're so excited. And they get to the first board meeting, and to prove that they're supposed to be in there, they're going to have a high value point to add on every topic that comes up throughout the meeting. And the rest of the room is going to be looking like, boy, did we make a mistake. This was not the right person to bring in here. Is that sort of an example of the scenario we're talking about?
Yes. And I will tell you, I recently had a conversation with a former CEO who, had her own board at her company and then now serves on boards. And she said one of the biggest turnoffs was when you could tell a board member was speaking simply because they felt like they needed to prove themselves, and they weren't actively listening and just adding value through questions. And that it's so crystal clear to tell the distinction of why they're talking, and that they maybe don't understand their role. And she sees that from both sides, because then sitting there, let's say at a table or at a virtual table, and that same dynamic is happening where a person is making sure they come in with a point. She said that feels so different for everyone else sitting at the table than when someone has, let's say, an experiential share, where they open their communication, and again, talk about like the warmth versus strength. they open with, well, here's an experience that I had, or here's how we dealt with something similar to our country in our company, and so here's how I see this applying versus I'm going to come in and prove. And I really think this comes back down to this idea of entering new situations with a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. And this is from Stanford psychologist Carol Dweck. And you can see this at high levels of operation where if you notice, if you can build self-awareness that there's something in you that's feeling like I've got to prove myself, that's the wrong energy to have. You've got to build that self-awareness to catch it and flip it, right? Which is, how can I provide the greatest value in this moment? What's my highest contribution for the mission of being a board member? And that might be not saying anything. That could be asking a question. That could be observing what's going on in the room. There's probably different options you have available to you, but you have to just notice what's driving you to speak up in that moment.
So that makes sense. And I imagine some people are listening to this going, okay, if we had gone back 3 years ago, I can picture that. I'm having conversations face to face. I can read a lot of the nonverbal cues. I can try to have my best EQ hat on and be someone who's warm and friendly and build relationships. That'll be really important. I get it. But Catherine, I'm on a Zoom world now, and my gosh, it's so much harder, and I'm thrown into the deep on this first board meeting. I haven't met half the people ever. I've had phone calls with some, but of course I can't see them. It was just on the phone. What you're saying makes so much sense. It's probably a lot harder to do for some people these days. How do you transition some of the best practice guidance you've got there into that new environment?
You're absolutely right. It is so much harder. Like, we're all living this, and we want to connect, and it's harder to connect. So I do have some nuts and bolts of, what you really have to dial in and make sure you're getting right, because we've essentially taken our three-dimensional way of connecting and we've put it on a screen. And so we're all two-dimensional and it's very flat. And what we know about presence is so much of it gets communicated through nonverbals, through our body language, through our eye contact, through the tone of our voice. So we're really limited to sound, our audio, and our visual. And so what I tell people when I'm advising them is, you've got to make sure everything about that is working for you. It's making it easier for people to connect with you. You're not actually making it harder. And the harder things I like to think of as static, right? Think about radios when you would turn the dial and how annoying and frustrating it was when you got just out of range. And all of a sudden that static started to creep in and you could kind of still hear the music or whatever you were listening to, but the static starts to get unbearable. And so then you would start, turning the dial until you landed on a clear channel again. There's similar things happening when you have, anything from just like your microphone's not working well, right? Like here we are on this podcast, like we want to make sure we have audio that it's really distracting and not enjoyable to listen to if you don't have crisp audio. So some people need external microphones, or they need to make sure the placement is operating well where they have it, that it's optimal. And then your video, you'd be amazed. I see the good, the bad, and the ugly, and this is happening at all levels. You've got to have a way where people can see you and that it feels the same as if we were connecting in person, which means the height of your camera is appropriate, right? That you're able to look into the camera. Eye contact is still the number one way we build trust. And I know it's completely awkward to be talking into a little hole, right, in your camera. But we've got to build that habit. Like, that's just a new muscle that we need to build. And hopefully we get back to a world where it becomes more of a hybrid, so we do get these in-person connections. But connecting virtually is going to be here to stay. So you've got to make sure that you feel comfortable having your camera on, that you know where you need to be looking. Those essentials are important. Like, there's no reason why you need to be so close to the camera that it looks like, you're about to eat it. We want to see your body language. If we build trust through there's three things. I'll just lay these out really plainly. Um, we build a lot of trust through eye contact, so that's important. The other thing that's uh, all humans are evaluating for is confidence, right? We're asking ourselves, is this person a winner or a loser? And that's not in like a zero sum, um, sorry, I didn't mean they win or lose. It's, are they good at being successful as themselves? That's the kind of confidence. It's not about, is this person a winner or a loser? And so everybody has the ability to show up as that best version of themselves. And we do that through body language, through posture. So again, when you're showing up online and we're only seeing, from the waist up, try to have your camera placement where we can see from your waist up. We can see your hands moving, because seeing hands is another way to express, to use our body language to become more animated. So you want to position things where we see the eye contact, we can see your posture. If you want to stand up, if that helps you feel more confident, to have an expansive stance, then have a way to use a standing desk. All these things are very tactical, and they make a difference. So it's building that muscle, and just, I'd say the biggest mistake people make is to be like, oh, this is too much, and they just turn their cameras off. I think so many people have missed out on staying connected and networking virtually because they just have their cameras off. Like, if people can't see you, you're forgotten. It's much harder.
Well, Katherine, I want to pivot us slightly, because there was something we talked about in the beginning. The term personal brand came out. And I'm sure that many people's ears picked up and going, oh, that's exactly what I need. And I imagine for some people that almost might fly in the face of some stuff we talked about here. We've talked about everyone should work on being, say, warm and authentic and inviting and engaged. And I imagine there's people going, is that the brand I'm trying to build? And I don't think that is. I think that may be a piece of it. Like, you are that, but all these other things. Most people probably heard as like, okay, I'm known for being a cyber guy, or I'm a chief HR officer, and I get how to manage people, different things like that. Help us bring all of these together as people think about how to build their brand so that it precedes them and opens the doors for the opportunities to land in the board.
Mm-hmm. Your personal brand is really how people, think of you when you're not around. And so, again, it's three-dimensional. So, yes, you want people to know you're the go-to person for this expertise you have. And they're also going to be, what kind of collaborator are you? How do you work with others? You want to have, I call it your compass, right? So for each individual, for a personal brand to be authentic, it needs to reflect who you are now in this moment, and you need that as a compass. So that drives how you communicate online, how you write, the choices you make, and how you follow up. When you have that compass, then you can be really true to yourself. And yes, some things may feel aspirational. Like, I want my personal brand to be this. And then you can say, well, so then who do you need to be? It's a guide, and it can continue as a North Star. And then the other piece, for a personal brand, is to understand that it's working for you when you're not around, right? If board service and the search for board service involves a lot of networking, right? Getting your brand out there so people know who you are and what you're looking for. I still have people on board say, I'm asked all the time, like, oh, we have a board seat opening up. Who do you know? So you never know when you've seated who you are out there in the world, someone's going to think of you. So you're making that imprint all the time with your personal brand. And you want it to be more than a one-dimensional, here's my expertise, here's what I do. It's, here's the person we're going to bring in who's going to fill this, and is going to be a great advisor, who's going to work well, who, the executive is going to feel like, yes, I want this person to be advising me, like, because it's meant to be a positive relationship, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, I agree with that, and I imagine some people probably heard these words, like online presence. Okay, how do I build that? How do I build that brand? In some ways, I imagine people are going, okay, they're probably envisioning LinkedIn, right? LinkedIn is brilliant because while I'm sleeping, I could be sharing my brand and drawing people into me. What is your guidance about how someone should best go about, say, maybe improving their online presence?
I think LinkedIn is a great start. It is a arena where there's lots of people checking you out and potentially checking you out. So do that, from a really practical standpoint. I think, everyone needs to make sure their profile is relevant and updated, and that it's an ambassador for you. It can be a little bit more. It can also be sharing more about your values. It can be telling a story about who you are, and you already have a CV, right? You have that, so use this not as just a replica. You don't just copy it onto there, but that you use it intentionally. And that's something I will say for all parts of our personal brand is it's about being intentional and being genuine with it. Yes, it can be aspirational, or but you want to use it and know why you're using it. So start with that. I'm sure you've seen lots of things, Alexander, of where personal brand, where it makes an impact.
Yeah, at the moment, I'm imagining the differences I saw. I lived in London for 7 years, and maybe cultural differences, but more than that I saw between, say, Americans and the British. We both sort of speak the same language, but imagine interviewing, for example, is very different. So when I was an American over in the UK, and say I was a management consultant, clients would have you interview to see if you'd be the consultant they'd have on the team. And if I said, look, I've cured cancer, I've had cancer, I've been to the moon and back 3 times, they all took everything you said at face value. I've got a list of contacts as long as my arm. They literally thought that's what you meant. Now in America, you're just sort of bigging yourself up a little bit. That's part of the game and how it goes. And so a British person, conversely, interviewing with American would be so understated. They might have actually cured cancer, but they say, I was a little bit of part of the team that kind of helped on this little thing over here. And it's just so fascinating when you think about it. There's a right way and a wrong way, not only to communicate between cultures, but your presence, to do it in a way so that it's going to match. So if you build up your presence somewhat, I'm envisioning where people have called into the boardroom. I remember seeing candidates where you're like, wow, you don't match with what we thought. And now we deem you as inauthentic, is what we talked about earlier in this show. But also in the same way, Katherine, I imagine if someone is sort of too meek and not putting themselves out enough, they might not get that initial call to come in to have part of the interview process. I'm sure there's sort of a red line you have to figure out how to get close to it without going over, right?
Yeah, I think you're right, and it's like everybody has to figure out where they're standing, right? Because you have people who are more understated or introverted, and when they navigate these things, they may not shine a light or bring forth, so it's easy for people to see it, some of their greatest strengths. And so I see it almost like a dial, right? They have to turn their dial up and figure out how it needs to get turned up enough so that they're not invisible or overlooked, right?
Right.
And then, the self-awareness from the other end, if you're used and very comfortable to maybe like do a bigger than life, and that turns people off because that goes back to being like, oh yeah, you're the really shiny, nice looking sports car, but then they actually get to meet you and they think, oh, this isn't what we ordered, this isn't what I wanted, there's not what we wanted under the hood. That takes a lot of self-awareness and reading a situation, right? The cultural differences, and specifically for where you're interviewing.
Katherine, I think I've got one question that's going to be able to tie this up with a pretty bow on it, right? But I think we could be going on and on for several hours around this. This is fantastic. And I want to make sure that people understand that this is something you do for a living. You've got your true self-presence consulting. You've got your leadership presence lab. And I'm sure many people are going to go, I need to learn more about this. I need to get some of Katherine's wisdom on certain topics. Help us understand more about sort of the day job, what you're doing, how people might go about it. We'll have links to the show notes, but then I can wrap it up with one final question for us.
Oh, sure. Okay, well, thanks. Going to my website or finding me on LinkedIn, so that's all going to be, you're going to provide all that. I work in two main ways. Primarily, I do a lot, my background is as an educator. So to me, I do workshops and trainings. I get in front of groups, associations, where I can bring this perspective and this knowledge to people so they can feel like they're bringing their full self and be intentional with their presence and personal brand. And then I do have people who come come to me and I offer one-on-one support. So that they can learn about, going to my website and just reaching out to contact me, because it always starts with a conversation of understanding where someone is and what kind of support they need.
So with that in mind, we're going to finish this off, bringing this together in the boardroom. And I want to tie together some things we've talked about, right? Like who you are, maybe 9 to 5 versus who you are at nights and on the weekends, and authenticity, right, which is where we started today. So the board search process can be very long. I referenced an example before, maybe it's a couple of years to land that desired seat. And I'm sure based on what you said today, you would say you want to be consistent, right? In who you're being and how you're showing up, because that's going to be an authentic you. But if you're not potentially authentic, right, then there's the personal you and the professional you, and there might be a toll that takes upon you. You're exhausting yourself, compartmentalizing how you show up and what the brand is perhaps in different places. And professionally, maybe you're not seen, you're not heard, you're not valued because you're performing instead of being present. Boy, this sounds really hard. So I'm going to give you the floor. Last thoughts on today. How does someone bring all that together?
That is a big question, but it pulls it all together. The more we shed things that are performance-based for ourselves, which means seeing ourselves through who we're being, how we're communicating with the world, and how we show up, the more aligned that can be, and there's synchronicity, that reads as authenticity. That people see that as genuine. And so when we break it apart in all those components like you just did, it does sound, because it sounds like it's something we've got to do. But in reality, leadership and alignment in our presence is about your strengths, and you open up instead of coming with that, I've got to be a certain thing, but you focus on everything you've done, who you know yourself to be, the values you're grounded in, and you get rid of what I call costumes and masks. You're not checking off each individual thing. They come together because that's the power of your presence, right? And so it gets elevated and amplified as it becomes more congruent and consistent. So with individual clients, we talk about their range, right? So authenticity is not, this is who I am, take it or leave it, and you shove it out there in the world. Authenticity for leaders is understanding the impact you have on others and taking ownership of that and being able to shift your own energy when it's required. And so instead of playing the same piano keys over and over, you actually expand to have a whole set of keys that you can play when appropriate. And so I think that helps people move away from any overwhelm they feel like, how do I do this? How do I be 100% consistent? Meaning you have to do the same thing over and over. It's actually, how do you have an authentic range that you can fluidly move through in your life, especially over the course of many years, because you're going to evolve and change. Like, we do not stay the same person our whole lives. So we don't want that pressure of like, okay, who are you? And then like, stay there. You're going to grow and evolve. And hopefully as you're going through these searches and you can speak to that and what you're going to bring to the table and the different perspectives you've gained. So I don't think there's a simple answer for you, Alexander, but I do think it's a process, and it doesn't end. The process of being, having great presence requires you to be present. And so it's an ongoing thing. We never arrive.
Well, Katherine, we appreciate your presence today, helping all of us to work on our presence. That was a present for us. So we were delighted to have you on this show today. Thank you for sharing your insights and helping all of us to be boardroom bound. That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Katherine Johnson. It was wonderful how she helped all of us understand our presence, our online persona, our trustworthiness, our authenticity, and how key all of these are and how they come together to be the sort of person that we want to reflect. And can we actually be the person online and in person, at home, at work, and how all of this is essential to being successful and actually landing the board seats and then doing well once we get there. Now remember, if you head over to podcast.gordon.edu, you will find links to all of today's resources. Please know that the Boardroom Bound team and I are so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you miss any of the high-quality content that we're bringing to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.